Okay. Hello, everyone. This is the video lecture on Act I of Hamlet. I'm going to try and keep these closer to 15 or 20 minutes rather than doing everything in an hour because I realize that gets overwhelming and it's harder for it to be uploaded to YouTube. So I'm going to dive right in. Hamlet is probably the most famous play in English literature and definitely one of the most famous in world literature. And it was written by William Shakespeare, who lived between 1558 and 1616, and who had started writing plays in London in the 1590s. And Shakespeare worked for a particular company who were patronized or sponsored by the Earl of Southampton. And then after Elizabeth I died, Shakespeare's company became sponsored by him, so they became the King's Men. And during both the reign of Elizabeth I and King James I, Shakespeare's plays were well regarded. He and the acting troupe were often called to perform at court for both Queen Elizabeth I and later for King James. And Hamlet is written probably shortly after Elizabeth has died and James I has come down from Scotland and become King of England. And Hamlet can be seen as part of a genre called the revenge tragedy. The revenge tragedy was a form of English tragedy that became pretty popular in the 1580s and the early 1590s, which was around the time that Shakespeare came down to London to try his luck first as a poet and then later as an actor and a playwright. And the most famous revenge tragedy was written by Thomas Kyd, and it was called the Spanish Tragedy. It was first published in 1587 and performed, and it still exists. And in some ways, it has a lot of the same characteristics that Hamlet does. There is a son avenging the murder of his father. There are mad scenes. There is betrayal. There is the use of a play to figure out who is the truly guilty murderer. And, there's the kind of ultimate fight of the good and the bad. But unlike the Spanish tragedy and some of the other tragedy plays that existed in that revenge tragedy genre, Hamlet's character is actually somewhat self-conscious that what he's doing is wrong. And that's part of the hesitation that he has in Hamlet. Whereas characters in the Spanish tragedy and other revenge tragedies tend to be like, I am avenging my father's death. And so whatever I do is a good thing, whether it's lying, pretending to be something I'm not, entrapment, poison, whatever. It's all for a better cause. Hamlet, at least in Shakespeare's play, actually hesitates, like, should I even believe the ghost? Am I doing the right thing? Maybe I need to set this up to be better. So I'm going to jump right into Act I. We start Act I with two minor characters, two guards, and they are talking about how there has been a ghost appearing on the ramparts of Elsinore Castle, where the royal family of Denmark lives. They also give us the background about what has happened to the royal family. The fact that King Hamlet, Hamlet Sr., had died of some kind of a poisonous snake bite while he was napping in the garden one day. And 2 months afterwards, his heir, his brother, Claudius, marries King Hamlet's widow, Gertrude. Meanwhile, King Hamlet's son, Hamlet, Prince Hamlet, Hamlet Jr., has been at university in Germany, and he had returned for both the mourning of his father's death and the marriage of his mother to his uncle. And so Horatio, Hamlet's best friend, is also back from school, and he talks to the two guards, Francesco and Marcellus. Love those really Danish Scandinavian names Shakespeare gives. And Horatio at first is skeptical and says, oh, come on, there's no such thing, you must be imagining it. And he says there has to be some kind of rational or understandable reason why this is happening. But the ghost appears before him and the others. And even though he doesn't speak, he does look, he says, oh my goodness, what is going on here? Because it does look like Hamlet's father dressed in battle armor. And he thinks that he has to tell his best friend Hamlet. That's where we shift then to scene 2, which is a stateroom in the castle. And here we have King Claudius basically explaining that, well, we've been through a rough period. We had a funeral, but we also had a marriage. So the funeral was kind of tainted by mirth and the marriage by sorrow. But we will kind of govern and take care of business as usual. This is also where we find out that the introduction of the Fortinbras plot. And in Act 1, Scene 1, we had found out that Fortinbras Sr., the King of Norway, had wagered with Hamlet Sr., King of Denmark, a one-on-one duel. And whoever won the duel would basically take over these lands that both of them had been claiming. So Hamlet Sr. had actually won the duel, and Fortinbras Sr. was dead. Fortinbras Sr.'s brother becomes the King of Norway. And young Fortinbras Jr., the dead King Fortinbras' son, has now been putting together an army and making noise about reclaiming the land. His attitude is basically, well, King Hamlet of Denmark, the man who killed my father and got those lands in a duel, he's dead now, so now I'm going to go back and claim those lands in the name of my father. We all have the establishment of a parallel between the Norway family, Fortinbras Sr., Fortinbras Jr., the King of Norway as an uncle, and the Denmark family, Claudius, Hamlet Jr.'s uncle, and the dead King Hamlet Sr. And Fortinbras does appear as an occasional foil to Hamlet and Hamlet's dilemma. So we get the introduction also of the family of Polonius, who is an advisor, a counselor to the King and Queen of Denmark. And he has 2 children, Laertes, a young man who is roughly the same age of Hamlet and who has been attending university in France, and Ophelia, who has been courted by Hamlet and who is kind of an only daughter, if you will. So we have the introduction of Hamlet, and we see that he is still in mourning for his father. And both Claudius and Gertrude are urging him, okay, the time has passed for mourning. Cast off your mourning clothes and start acting like life is back to normal. But Hamlet can't do this. And he basically says that my clothing and my gestures and my sorrow and my tears, they're not just an act that I'm putting on. In fact, I feel all these things genuinely. So what you see on the outside is what's going on inside. And he brings that up as kind of a critique of the fact that it's like, unlike all you other people who have been wearing mourning, even though you don't really feel any sadness or sorrow, which is kind of a pointed jab at Gertrude. It's like, you're not, if you missed your husband that badly, why did you marry 2 months after his death? And so we go on to his first soliloquy, which is Act 1, Scene 1, starts about line 129. Oh, that this too sullied flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew, or that the everlasting had not fixed his cannons 'gainst self-slaughter. Oh God, God, how weary, stale, flat, and unprofitable to me seems all the uses of this world. And basically saying out Hamlet's grief, and his grief is to the point of feeling suicidal. And what he is so genuinely upset about is how quickly his father has been forgotten, how everybody just kind of assumed that the initial explanation of his death, oh, he took a nap in the garden and he got stung by a snake and it was a poisonous snake and he died, the end. How he just like, it could not have been something like that. Furthermore, he's really upset with his mother because she not only married 2 months after her husband's death, but she married Claudius, his brother. And in Elizabethan terms, in-laws, say a sister-in-law, brother-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law, were almost seen as good as family. So a person having a relationship with an in-law, say a wife falls in love with her brother-in-law, her husband's brother, we would look at that today and be like, well, that's icky, that's immoral, that's gross, that's really, that's sad. To the Elizabethans, that would have been all that plus that's incestuous. Even if they are not related by blood, they've been connected to each other by marriage, they'd be like, you're basically sleeping with your, brother to them. And so Hamlet is appalled by that. But furthermore, he's appalled because he looks at Claudius and thinks, this man is so second rate compared to who my father was. And that Hamlet Sr. had loved Gertrude so much and had taken such good care of her and had been such an admirable man and a successful king, warrior, husband, etc. And that when he's dead, Gertrude basically runs into the arms of this second-rate loser who's kind of an incestuous relationship as well. So he's hating everybody right now. And that's when Horatio shows up and says, I have to tell you about this ghost that's been appearing on the ramparts of the castle. I believe that it is your father. It looks a lot like your father. And Hamlet is intrigued. On the one point, he thinks that it might be some kind of a phantasm sent to torture the family or some kind of a supernatural figure that is not necessarily his father's ghost. But then Hamlet's like, so in that case, I really want to see it. So in scene 3, we have Hamlet going with Horatio and, oh no, scene 3 is different. I'm sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Scene 3 is where we shift to the family of Polonius. And we open with Laertes and Ophelia talking to each other. And Laertes is getting ready to go back to college in France. But he says to Ophelia, it seems that Hamlet's been paying a lot of attention to you, right? And Ophelia says, yes, that's true. And Laertes says, you need to understand something. Hamlet can't pick the person he falls in love with and marries, because he's the heir to the throne. His marriage is going to be based on political alliances. Basically, it will be an arranged marriage. So he is not going, any kind of affection or friendship or courtship or romantic attention you get from him, it's not going to lead to marriage. Hamlet is not going to marry one of his own subjects, and much less a commoner, even if the commoner is coming from a highly placed family in the government. So he's like, so you need to start discouraging him. And Ophelia is kind of hesitant, but Laertes says, I would hate to hear about you being fooled by him, sleeping with him, getting your reputation ruined, and basically being used and tossed aside when Hamlet goes to marry a princess from another country. So you need to slow things down with him. And she agrees to that. And then Laertes sees his father Polonius, who comes to give him all this kind of cliched, contradictory information. And some of this is some, famous lines that we've heard that have entered the English language, such as, neither a borrower nor a lender be. This above all to thine own self be true. And again, Polonius is trying to set Laertes up to be kind of successful at networking and schmoozing without giving away his real self, his real opinions. He's like, it's always better to listen than to speak. and be friendly with people, but don't be close to many people. And so Laertes skips off to get ready for his voyage, and again Polonius talks to Ophelia about their concerns that he and Laertes have. And again, he just kind of repeats what Laertes had said earlier. And he says, you need to start acting cooler towards Hamlet. Don't allow yourself to be alone with him. Don't get into deep, intimate conversations with him. Don't take any presents. Don't answer any letters. Basically, you need to withdraw so he leaves you alone and leaves your reputation and your virginity intact. And Ophelia agrees to that. So now we get to the ramparts, and it's night, and we get to Hamlet and Horatio have arrived, and they have talking to the two guards, Marcellus and Francisco. And Hamlet sees the ghost, and he says, angels and ministers of grace defend us. This starts on line 40 of scene 4. Be thou a spirit of health or goblin damned, bring with thee airs from heaven or blast from hell. Be thy intents wicked or charitable, thou comest in such a questionable shape that I will speak to thee. I'll call thee Hamlet, king, father, royal Dane. And so at this point he's like, I don't know if you are actually my father's ghost. I don't know if you are actually some demonic spirit in disguise to fool me. But I'm going to address you as my father, the late king. And he wants to know, basically, why has your spirit been allowed to walk the earth again? But the ghost will not speak to him unless he goes off and leaves the others behind. So even though Horatio and the guards are like, no, Hamlet, don't do it, Hamlet agrees to follow the ghost to a point where they can talk privately. And that is when the ghost reveals to Hamlet, yes, I am your father's spirit, and I'm allowed to walk at night on earth for a few times before I'm consigned to the fires of hell forever. And I'll explain why he's ended up in hell, being tortured by eternal fire. He says, I want to tell you what actually happened to me. And he says, I was not bitten by a poisonous snake. I was murdered. And Hamlet's like, that's what I thought. And then the ghost further explains, and I was murdered by my brother, your uncle Claudius. And Hamlet is just like, I suspected that all along. I knew there was something fishy about him. And the ghost says, and I'm very upset that my wife, Gertrude, would stoop to marry my, less than spectacular brother. It makes me wonder if she had ever really loved me at all, or if she just loved being married to a king of Denmark, no matter who he is. And the king's ghost also says, maybe she was just fooled by her own lust. That could be the only reason why she would choose to marry and go to bed with such an inferior man, instead of staying true to my memory and being a widow for the rest of her life. So the king then explains, finally, when your uncle poisoned me, he did it while I was sleeping, and there was no way I could wake up. I was killed more or less instantly, and that did not allow me any time as a Christian to have last rites administered to me. So he didn't get a chance to say his prayers. He didn't get a chance to confess his sins and to be forgiven of them. And that is why his soul ended up in hell. Not because he was a particularly bad or evil person, but because he did not have that final opportunity to have his sins forgiven and to pray for God's mercy and grace and forgiveness. So Hamlet Sr. wants his son to avenge his death. He wants him to kill Claudius and to make sure it's in such a manner that Claudius will suffer the same fate that his soul is suffering, if not worse. So Hamlet agrees to this, and he agrees that he will remember his father and remember the duty that he owes his father's soul. He also starts to think about his mother, both in terms of kind of like, ugh, what's wrong with her? She's just driven by lust to marry my uncle, the murderer. I mean, did she know that is actually, how he died, or did she fall for the trick? Does that make her stupid, or does that make her deceitful and well aware she's married her first husband's murderer? And then Horatio and the two guards come up to Hamlet, and Hamlet makes them all swear, do not tell anybody what you have seen tonight. And they all agree to that. They all swear, we will not tell anyone about seeing the ghost or about seeing Hamlet talking to this ghost. But then one more request comes from Hamlet. And he says, if I start acting kind of weird, like I lost my mind or I've become mad, don't let on that you know anything about this. Don't kind of look at people like, oh yeah, Hamlet is so crazy. I wonder what he's so upset about. Yeah. He's like, I'd be mad if I were that angry too. He's like, just act like you are just as befuddled and confused as everyone else, because this is going to be part of my plan. And so they all agree to it. And Act I concludes with a rhyming couplet. Shakespeare usually does that. He usually concludes scenes and acts with a nice little couplet that kind of drives home the main point. So Hamlet says at the very bottom, line 189, 190, I just want to set up the speech. He says, God willing, we shall not lack. Let us go in together and still your fingers on your lips, I pray. The time is out of joint, O cursed spite, that ever I was born to set it right. Nigh come, let's go together. And that little rhyming couplet basically brings up the fact that there's something wrong here. And the time is out of joint. Everything is out of place. It's out of order. And Hamlet kind of curses the fact that he is the person who's supposed to set everything right, put everything back in order, because he feels like he may or may not be up to the task. So, and also it's just simply the fact of responsibility. Oh crap, I have to, avenge my father's murder. I have to get rid of, my uncle usurper. I have to kind of break the news to my mother if she doesn't know it, or to basically let her know that I'm onto her and I've lost a lot of respect for her. Yep, that's what you got to do. So that concludes my kind of walkthrough of the first act of Hamlet. But I want you to pay attention to the idea of the Fortinbras, the Norway plot, as a parallel to what is going on here in Denmark. And also the idea of the court of Denmark as a place that is out of joint. There is something rotten in the state of it. And it is a place where people basically put on one face while doing another. People pretend to mourn when they're really secretly relieved or indifferent that Hamlet Sr. is dead. People buy one version of the king's death when the actual truth is much more sinister. And people are very interested in kind of controlling other people's lives. Both Laertes and Polonius want to make Ophelia reject Hamlet. And as they would say, well, it's for her sake, it's for her good reputation. No one will marry her if they think that she was, Prince Hamlet's mistress. But Ophelia seems to be like a cipher at this point. She kind of blandly agrees with whatever they're saying. So as we continue with Acts 2, 3, and on to the end, we're going to see how some of these themes, things are not what they seem, things are dysfunctional, they're rotten. We have the revenge tragedy is going to start being set in place. And we have the Fortinbras parallel to the Hamlet Denmark situation set up. So I'm going to wrap this thing up now. It looks like I went on a little too long. Sorry about that. And I will see you when we get to Act 2 of Hamlet.